This video is sponsored by US Warmasters. More about this event later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another Best Armies in Warhammer 40k. This is the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the past weekend and talk about what's currently winning the game. And this week, we are going to be discussing lists using the new balanced data slate. This does mean that several events that did not use the balanced data slate will not be included in my results. However, it does mean that all of the events that we discuss this week will be using the most up-to-date metagame. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we move into a metagame breakdown is that this is a relatively small sample size, so anything that we look at right now is likely going to be pretty heavily weighted towards factions that got new mechanics or large updates in this new format. I don't think it's going to be particularly representative of all of the things that are going to be very strong in the new format, but it is really interesting to take a peek. And the interesting results come in with Astra Militarum and their new Grizzled company detachment, with 3 total undefeated players. Now, part of the reason for this is the Winter WOG 2025. This was a relatively large event, 63 total players going down in Great Britain, and ended up with a Grizzled company mirror match in the final round, which ended with 2 undefeated Astra Militarum players at this event. They both got a natural draw, not using differential scoring, 75-75, in order to put both of those results on the list here, which is pretty wild. We do have a couple of other ties that are kind of inflating things a little bit, which we see as we move on down to Death Guard. They did end up taking down the 1UP Games Get a Life GT. That was with a draw on their record as well, but ended up actually winning the event, going undefeated and taking first place. However, at Rise of the Empire GT, this event actually used a top cut. The pre-cut round ended in a draw, which knocked a player out of the top cut. That ended up being a draw between Death Guard and Chaos Space Marines. Those players did not make it to the finals. However, we did see Astra Militarum eventually win it with a 6-0 record. In addition to that, Blood Angels also doing well with their new Rage-Cursed Onslaught detachment, taking down both the Winter WOG with an ultimate 5-0 record, as well as the Charity GT for NFBNJ. In addition to that, Emperor's Children took down the Gothic Games Canterbury despite their recent nerfs. Drukhari took down the Twin Dragons Cup GT. Dark Angels won the Safeties Off second coming of the Double Christmas Charity GT. Try saying that 5 times fast. And as I mentioned before, we saw an undefeated Chaos Space Marine player pre-top cut at Rise of the Empire GT. So let's talk about these lists just after a word from our sponsor. This video is brought to you by US Warmaster. You might have heard of the Warmaster event at WTC, one of the largest and most competitive single-player super major events of the season. And this year, the folks over at Away Games and ATC are bringing the same level of competition to the United States. The US Warmaster event aims to be one of the largest and most competitive venues for 1v1 single play in US Warhammer 40k and mirror the competition at the WTC. In fact, it's being organized with the express permission and collaboration of the World Team Championship team, and the winner of the US Warmaster event is going to get a free ride to the Warmaster event at the World Team Championships, including ticket price, travel, and accommodations paid for. If you've experienced Away Games or ATC events in the past, you know the level of event support that's going to be available at this one, and this one has massive competition and huge prizes on the line as well. So mark your calendar for January 24 and 25th, 2026 in Cleveland, Tennessee for the US Warmaster event. So I'll see you there in Tennessee and potentially in Europe if you win that ticket to the World Team Championship. So we'll start with our current metagame frontrunner, this being Astra Militarum. David Smith took down the Rise of the Empire GT with a 6-0 record with a Grizzled company detachment. Now, this is obviously the brand new detachment that came out this past week and focuses very heavily on the Astra Militarum's order mechanic. It gives your officers an additional order that they can issue, as well as granting bonuses to units that receive orders. This includes reroll 1s to hit and reroll 1s to wound if you attack enemies in range of an objective marker. Now, in this case, we were running a Cadian command squad, a Commissar with Abhuman Detail, which grants the Commissar the ability to attach to Ogren or Bulgren squads, and allows him to issue orders to that unit. Now, that also allows them to then benefit from the detachment ability for reroll 1s to hit, but also, because he's a Commissar, he can order things like Duty and Honor and Fixed Bayonets in order to buff the melee profile of units like Bulgrin. So huge improvement to the melee output of those guys. We then also have Gaunt's Ghosts for some end of phase order activation. The benefit here is that the detachment ability doesn't specify when you have to issue you basically just increase the numerical number of orders you can issue by 1, because units can issue orders the turn that they arrive out of reserve. If they do so at the end of the movement phase, Gaunt's Ghost is then able to drop in and issue 3 orders out of reserve instead of 2. We lastly have Lord Solar Leontis, so he's going to be hopping into the Cadian Command Squad using their Master Vox, and he is improving his already impressive 3 order value up to an order value of 4. So we have a massive battery of orders between Gaunt's Ghost and Leontis that we're going to be able to issue. Now we do have a Cadian Shock Trooper Squad to dual attach Lord Solar and the Cadian Command Squad. A pair of Chimeras. These guys are going to be carrying around 2 Kazarkin squads, so they'll grant Scout to the transport. The detachment also has a couple of benefits to these guys. This includes strength improvements, lethal hits, or ignore cover to your ranged attacks. In addition to that, you also have a shooting phase Armor of Contempt effect that targets anything in the faction if you are benefiting an already high armor save value unit. So, for example, the Kazarkin squad can hop out, be ordered by Gaunt's Ghosts once they come out of the Chimeras. Fire benefit from the bonus damage stratagems that you can use in your own shooting phase. Then when you move to your opponent's turn, you can use Warrior Elite to turn on your take cover on these guys to give them effectively a 3+ save. Then you can reduce armor penetration characteristics targeting them, which then actually makes them kind of difficult to kill in the swing back as well if you don't need the Warrior Elite to do extra damage, or if you have the use of it available during your opponent's turn if you go second. On top of that, we also have some additional synergy with that stratagem in the form of a trio of Leman Russ Vanquishers. These guys are also going to be able to make use of that stratagem. These guys are also going to be able to be ordered by Lord Solar Leontis, and they give you very, very easy access to anti-tank shooting with high reliability because they can get their own built-in wound rerolls. They can reroll hit rolls of 1. You can get Leman Russ Vanquishers down to hitting on 2s, reroll their own wound roll on their Vanquisher battle cannon shot. So they're basically going to be very close to. So they're going to be very close to full rerolls with their cannon shot, but they're also just cheap and super resilient defensive profiles. Speaking of that, we also have a Rogel Dorn battle tank for the same reason, who can then start to stack these defensive mechanics with his own Blade of Armor plus the additional armor from the stratagem. We have a Bulgrin squad for that Commissar to hop into, a Cadian heavy weapons squad, where you can get ignore cover on heavy weapons to punch into light infantry, which is nice. The rerolls as well also give these guys a nice boost on their indirect fire in the early game, because we're almost always going to have additional orders available for them, whether that's from the platoon commander or Lord Solar, for example. We have the Bulgrin squad for the Commissar, so we have a bit of a melee bulwark in the center, another good target for additional armor, because we are trying to stack those resilience benefits to these guys. Unfortunately, they cannot be ordered with go to ground, take cover, but they can get the additional armor stratagem. Lastly, we have a pair of Attilan Rough Rider squads, these guys for some additional melee counterpunch. So we have 3 big tanks plus a Bulgrin squad that's going to be able to dominate the middle of the table. They can follow up after these fast Chimeras range out and deliver Kazarkin into your opponent's face. Get those Kazarkin ordered by either their own orders or, in addition, Gaunt's Ghost's orders, so that they can deal some significant damage, put the line of scrimmage on your opponent's side, then fill the board with his highly resilient armor. All of that's being buffed by Lord Solar Leontis, and then anything that's able to punch through that is going to get countercharged by the Attilan Rough Riders that can, again, get all of the benefits of this attachment ability. The other thing, too, is that Attilan Rough Riders with a base weapon skill of 3, if you do have the orders available to grant them fixed bayonets, and you can do this a couple different ways. You can either give them fixed bayonets to begin with if they don't need the extra movement from move in order to get into range, or you can use move and move the unit, then redeploy Gaunt's Ghosts next to them to then issue their order and replace move with fixed bayonets. Either one of those will work. Then, once they're affected by an order, they get hit rerolls of 1, so they're hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, potentially rolling 1s to wound with their lance attacks as well. So the damage output for only 120 points from these guys is already at a baseline incredible, but on top of the detachment ability, it really makes these low volume, high impact attacks way more consistent, which is incredibly powerful for the faction. Now, with that, we'll move to another event that was dominated by Astra Militarum, but we aren't going to be talking about Astra Militarum this time. This was the Winter WOG 2025, which was actually won with the only fully X and O record with no ties on its record by Matt Charles and his Rage Cursed Onslaught Blood Angels. This detachment gives Blood Angels an interesting alternative way to play that is similar but not quite the same as their Liberator Assault Group detachment. It gives them a slightly different sort of side-graded benefit. They get rear ones to wound all the time in melee, in addition to +1 attack when they charge. This becomes +2 attacks instead if they are battle shocked, and they have many ways to battle shock themselves. In this particular list, Matt was playing a Jump Pack Captain with Angel's Fang. This is a melee enhancement that gives you sustained hits 2 when targeting character, monster, or vehicles for the bear itself, not their unit. Nice little bonus, but a little inconsistent because you do have to roll 6s in order to get that. The idea here is that you use that on things like Death Company captains who can get hit rerolls built in from their Black Rage. However, we're doing it on a standard Jump Pack Captain with a Power Fist this time. We have a second Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Jump Pack Captain, as well as a Chaplain with Master of the Red Thirst. This gives him a once per game use of Fights First. Now, the nice thing about the Chaplain is that he does give you the benefit of +1 to wound without having to charge with it. So he can work as a defensive piece. You can take a charge with him. He's still going to get his +1 to wound. So the downside of not getting your charge bonuses, whether that's Lance or the +1 or +2 attacks that you would get from the detachment ability, is less of an issue with Chaplains specifically. On top of that, we have Commander Dante for his long threat range, Lamarties because the detachment is focused very heavily on Death Company units, as well as a Combi Lieutenant for utility. Now, the Death Company units in particular can use stratagems like Insensate Rampage to get a 5+ Feel No Pain, as well as Deathless Duty for 2 CP. Now, for these characters to attach into, we're going to be taking a bunch of Death Company Jump Pack Marines, as well as 3 Sanguinary Guard. Now, one of the Death Company Jump Pack Marines can attach with the Chaplain with Fights First. The nice thing here is that these guys have a large wound pool and then access to that 5+ Feel No Pain from Insensate Rage. So they can actually tank for a little bit. And the Chaplain giving you a once per game Fight First means that your opponent probably isn't necessarily going to kill all 10 Space Marines in shooting. They're forced to charge into melee. You get Fights First, and you might be able to pick them up or at least keep yourself alive by dealing damage before they get to swing into you in the fight phase. Lamarties can stack that 5+ Feel No Pain stratagem with his own -1 damage to make the unit actually legitimately very hard to kill. And especially alongside the additional attacks that these guys are getting, plus the lethal hits from Lamarties, plus the hit rerolls that they have built in, the other benefit is that these guys don't necessarily need Oath of Moment to do that much damage because they have hit rerolls already for being Death Company Marines, and they can do some pretty serious damage without really any other support while being very tanky. Now, on top of that, we have 3 units of Sanguinary Guard. That's going to be able to attach the 2 captains as well as Commander Dante, and that gives you some very high efficiency, just solid attacks. These guys are bringing a combination of Encarmine Spears and Blade units and 1 Spear unit. These individually have high impact melee attacks. They are 2+ weapon skill. They're relatively high strength. They can have lance if they are attacking with the spear profile. So getting additional bonus attacks on those from the detachment ability is actually a really big deal. On top of that, you can use limb from limb to give them +1 strength or armor penetration characteristic, or you can battle shock them, which again then gives them an additional +1 to attack value from the detachment ability in order to get +1 strength and AP. The implicit synergy there is that Sanguinary Guard, equipped with a Sanguinary Banner, which they get automatically, retain Objective Control 1 while they're battle shocked, because the banner just adds +1 to their OC value. Their base OC value of 1 becomes 0, then you add +1 from the banner, so they remain at OC 1. Obviously, it does have their OC. They go from 2 to down to 1, and they can't use stratagems and can't perform actions. They get all the downsides of being battle shocked. However, they don't necessarily prevent you from holding or capturing objectives, which is huge. So these guys can run in, they can use all of their stratagems at full power, and then they can battle shock themselves with the last use of a stratagem, essentially, is what you want to be doing. And then they come in with just massive amounts of damage. Wound rerolls on them as well is incredibly strong because they typically are wounding on things on 3s, maybe 4s. And the better your wound roll is, the higher value those rerolls of 1 become because the chance you convert the reroll is much higher. You're not necessarily losing efficiency by having high effectiveness attacks that you're not going to be rerolling because they already wound naturally, because a wound roll of 1 would always normally fail. So we have 2 units of 10 jump pack infantry, jump pack Death Company Marines, 3 units of 3 sanguinary guard to attach all the captains. We then have some infantry sweeping in the early game from a pair of ball predators. There is an advance and shoot stratagem in the detachment, Red Wrath, which allows you to advance and shoot or advance and charge. You can also battle shock yourself to do both. It's very much like Liberator Assault Group. But what these guys are good at doing is cooking utility units or screening units in the early game without having to dedicate your Death Company Marines to do so. We then also have a trio of Assault Jump Pack Intercessors, another unit that I think really likes the reroll 1s to wound, especially if you can give them +1 strength, so they wound a lot of utility units on 3s. Rerolling 1s is pretty high efficiency. If they're targeting their at the moment target, you're getting almost full rerolls, and that makes a Jump Pack Intercessor squad very likely to kill a toughness 4 or so enemy that it charged. And then we have an Intercessor squad to hold down the back line. The coolest part about this detachment is I think the way it makes your battle shock synergies actually work. Getting a bonus while you're battle shocked and allowing yourself to battle shock yourself for benefit is a really cool effect. And the fact that it allows you to play normally strong Blood Angels units alongside Death Company and not focusing specifically on Death Company, I think makes it a fairly well-designed and well-rounded detachment. It's not surprising to me that it is seeing some success. Plus, people love just high finesse Blood Angels armies that are focused very heavily on combat phases. Now, taking a peek at Death Guard for a moment, we did have them take down one event, although they did obviously have that bizarre 75-75 tie at Rise of the Empire. In this case, Gabriel Nixon was able to win the 1UP Games Get a Life GT with an X0-1 record, so 1 draw on their record, but otherwise undefeated, and they ended up placing first in that event with a Virulent Victorium. So this is the basic, essentially, index detachment from Death Guard that grants them army-wide objective secure. Now, in this case, Gabriel was playing a little bit of a non-standard variety that focused incredibly heavily on just standard Plague Marines. He was bringing a single Biologus Putrefier as well as 3 Malignant Plague Casters. So obviously the combo here is that one of these can dual attach with the Putrefier and the Plague Caster together to get 5 up criticals plus lethal hits from the Putrefier on all their weapons, plus sustained hits from the Malignant Plaguecaster, so you're going to be able to just fully combo out these guys. You can also use Creeping Blight to full hit and wound reroll them, so they have a very strong chance of getting all of those lethal and sustained hit criticals into an afflicted target. And then that is also further benefited by the other Plague Marine squads. There's then 3 units of 5 Plague Marines in addition to that 1 unit of 10 who can shoot into a target to apply affliction to it to ensure that your Plague Marines benefit from that stratagem as well as from your Malignant Plaguecaster abilities, regardless of their proximity to them. On top of that, we have a Demon Prince of Nurgle to unlock these abilities with free stratagems. The fact that we do have a bunch of individual infantry units is helpful for him as well, because it's going to be able to grant him Lone Operative. He has Revolting Regeneration for a 5+ Feel No Pain, which obviously makes him pretty difficult to get rid of. We then have a bunch of very standard inclusions for Death Guard. This includes a trio of heavy Blight Launcher Fetid Bloat Drones. The heavy Blight Launchers can benefit from Overwhelming Generosity if you do have one of those Playcasters or the Biologus Putrefier in line of sight of a target. You then get rerolls on the number of attacks that those guys will make. And then we have some additional backline shooting from a pair of Chaos Predator Destructors. These guys can then benefit with the additional bonus AP and Contagion, so they can stack their +1 AP against infantry with the Contagion AP, so they can potentially be getting +2 AP, so they can deal some pretty serious damage into a lot of stuff. Plus, having an autocannon, it's relatively low strength, but is able to then benefit from the -1 toughness that enemies get from being contagioned either by the Plague Marines or by proximity to your army, in addition to the lethal hits that they get for being a Death Guard Predator, is always helpful. Now, in addition to this, there's also a trio of Malignant Plaguecasters. So these guys could be just vibing by themselves independently, or they could play inside the Plague Marine squads. Not 100% sure exactly how this works in this case. Likely that we had 1 Plague Marine squad that was hiding in the back line, and then 2 Plague Marine squads in addition to the 2 Plaguecasters embarked one of the 2 Rhinos in the list. There also are 2 Chaos Rhinos, one certainly for the 10-man Plague Marine unit plus the 2 characters. The other one's probably taking 2 5-mans. Whether or not the Plaguecasters were attached is an interesting question. position. The nice thing is that you're able to then move the Rhino around and fire the Plaguecasters out of its firing deck to deal some damage. However, you don't necessarily need them in the Plague Marine unit in order to do that, and the Plague Marines can act by themselves as kind of independent, either utility units or units that can run up and actually kill opposing utility units and disrupt objectives. So I would venture to guess that we actually ran the Malignant Plaguecaster separately, but there certainly is an argument to be made to attach them to get the little bit of additional benefit that we get from the little 5-man Plague Marine squads. Now, on top of that, the nice benefit of the Virulent Victorium with these sort of transport Plague Marine-centric builds is that obviously once you are dumping 2 OC Plague Marines onto an objective, there's a strong likelihood that you will be able to control it at the end of your command phase. So if your opponent shoots a Rhino to death, you disembark the Plague Marines onto the Rhino, and they don't have any follow-up shooting to kill the Plague Marines, they're then going to obsec that objective. This works for everything, so it works for things like the Plaguecasters if they're in the Rhino as well. So you're able to obsec objectives even if your opponent's killing your units that are standing sort of in the open there. But it's definitely interesting to see a list that is focused so heavily on Plague Marines. I know that the 10-man is fairly common. Sometimes we see a 7 as well to save points, although you don't get as many special weapons if you do that. And you oftentimes see the multiple Malignant Plaguecasters because they're one of the most efficient and effective profiles in the faction right now. However, the mass 5-man units of Plague Marines is certainly very interesting. Now, with that, we're moving over to the Gothic Games Canterbury for Emperor's Children. Oliver Jawara went undefeated with the faction at this event using Coterie of the Conceited. Now, this isn't new or shocking. Court of the Phoenician, I think, is a little bit of a dud when it comes to the Grotsmas detachments. And as it stands, Coterie of the Conceited is still probably the best way to play the faction. The downside being that you did get more expensive Winged Demon Princes. They were nerfed yet again. I think they're up 35 points from their original printed points value, which is wild at this point, which does just make it sort of more difficult to build this specific style of list, which is really unfortunate, but it is what it is. In this case, Oliver was playing a trio of Winged Demon Princes, one of them with Pledge of Unholy Fortune, so he's able to flip his dice to 6s. We have 3 Lord Exultants, a Lord Cacophonist, so cutting Lucius or any of the other characters from the detachment. We have 3 Infractor squads to attach with the Lord Exultants, plus a Tormentor squad for utility. There is a Chaos Spawn unit in here, which has been had its cost reduced, which is very nice. It's a nice little quality of life change. 2 Chaos Rhinos in order to ferry around the Tormentors and then allow your Noise Marines to hop in those as well afterwards. We then have 3 Noise Marines, obviously, all of those with blasters and blastmasters and their sonic blasters. One of those obviously going to attach with the Lord Cacophonist as well. I guess I should mention Lord Cacophonist in this case is running 2 Screamer pistols. There are some situations in which you will use a melee weapon on that guy if you expect to get into melee or to try to make charges out of rapid ingress, but that's very rare, and most of the time you're going to be trying to maximize range damage from these. But it is classic Coterie of the Conceited that we've seen a million times before. Not too much else to say about this, but I will say that it's nice to see Emperor's Children continuing to do well, even if I think they got a little bit mistreated by the data slate. Now, with that, let's move on over to the Twin Dragons Cup. We just love dragons over here. And a list and a player that we've actually seen on the channel in the past, especially after the World Championships of Warhammer, where he basically single-handedly redefined how the Drukhari Codex was being played, that being Steve Tremble with his Spectacle of Spite. If you weren't aware, before the World Championships, I think everyone was expecting to see some high impact out of Reaper's Wager in the Drukhari Codex. However, he came out and actually showcased a dramatically stronger finish than literally every other Drukhari player in the world, that Spectacle of Spite was actually probably the best way to play this faction. In this case, he's running Lady Malice, Lilith Hesperax, a Succubus with Morgana's Curse, so that's the AP and damage enhancement. That's going to be able to put her Agonizer up to AP 3 damage 2. It's 7 attacks, it hits on 2s, it's anti-infantry 3, although its base strength characteristic is not that exciting. And these can improve further with the Spectacle of Spite detachment ability, which gives you, in your command phase, different buffs. You can get +1 strength, for example, you can get +1 AP to this weapon profile, which can make it pretty scary. On top of that, we're running another pair of Succubi as well. Those are going to be attaching into some combination of the 50 witches that are in the list. We have 5 units of 10 witches. 4 of those are going to get split in 2 by venoms, so they're going to get combat squatted, so each of them becomes 5 just ground-pounding regular witches who we can use for utility. We can put them in strat reserve, we could just run them around, hold objectives, and be obnoxious, screen, do utility unit stuff, and then 5 that are going to be in a venom for much greater threat range and greater capacity to perform utility actions. We then have 1 unit of 10 that's going to be hanging out in a raider. The big thing we want to be doing with these units is threatening a challenge met, which allows you to charge in your opponent's movement phase to disrupt their movement and disrupt their positioning. In this case, having larger units is certainly helpful for that, and especially the ability to sort of send them out with a relatively long threat range, advance and charge by themselves to mess with your opponent's positioning is huge. So the big unit of 10, I'm sure, is going to be pretty helpful for that. Now, on top of that, we're also running a bunch of high impact, high mobility units that we can use for a little bit more dedicated damage, not just into infantry like the witches are being built for. This includes a single Chronos, as well as a trio of Hellion squads, 2 units of 10. These guys have high base characteristics. They can empower into additional attacks and strength, so they can get even higher. And then once you benefit them with combat drugs to get things like additional strength or additional AP, the Hellion profile goes absolutely insane. These guys are where a lot of the damage of the list is going to come from. On top of that, we also have 3 Reaver squads. These guys did get a little bit more expensive in the data slate update. I don't think, clearly not enough to stop them from seeing play because the data sheet is so solid. We have 2 units of 6, as well as a unit of 3. They bring mortal wound output from their ability to move over enemies and deal mortal wounds to them. And then they also bring heat lances, which can provide some really much needed anti-tank to the army. Plus, there's the fact that they're incredibly, incredibly fast. They're able to move 22 inches on an advance with an empowerment, which allows them to just absolutely blitz across the table, jail your opponent, complete secondaries, steal their objectives, all that kind of stuff. Kind of a little bit of Warp Spider energy from these guys, except they're also packing basically like Melta lances. On top of that, we are also running a Chronos to be able to use these empowerment abilities while regenerating pain tokens over the course of the game. Now, with that, we are going to be moving over to the Safeties Off second coming of the Double Christmas Charity GT. Longest name in history. This is won by Jonathan Arkin from Happy Crumping Wargaming, who was playing Dark Angels in a Wrath of the Rock detachment. Now, this is a bit of a classic Wrath of the Rock detachment with some additional spice included. This includes things like a Terminator Ancient with Deathwing Assault, which allows him to deep strike in your first reinforcement step, so you can keep a Deathwing Night Squad in reserve early, have the Ancient attaching with the unit, and then if you need to, top of 1, you can hop them in and do stuff with them. You can threaten charges on future turns. They can't wrap an ingress turn 1 because it only works in your own movement phase. However, it does let you do things like set up to stage earlier, or you can run in and threaten, or just make 9-inch charges if you're an absolute Chad. We do have an Inner Circle Companion unit. That's for Azrael to hop into. He is also included in the army. The Inner Circle Companions then get sustained hits from Azrael, plus they get an invulnerable save, which they are naturally lacking, which is a match made in heaven for them. We have a pair of scout squads for utility. Nice thing, too, is that you get the -1 to wound against attacks with a higher strength than your toughness value, even into the scouts, which can make them kind of sticky to kill. Scouts are one of the weirdest, most annoying defensive profiles in the game to actually remove very efficiently, and with a -1 to wound effect, you have to wildly overcommit to actually kill them, which usually means that your opponent just won't even bother. We also then have an Inceptor squad with Plasma Exterminators for a little bit of additional utility and some shooting. This is just a 3-man, so nothing too exciting going on here. We have 1 Gladiator Lancer for some backline shooting, a Calidus Assassin for up down, and a little bit of additional CP tax, alongside 2 units of Deathwing Knights, one of them for the Terminator Ancient to attach into, a Desolation squad for some backline indirect fire, and last but certainly not least, Lionel Johnson, the great man himself, plus a combi weapon lieutenant. So we can do the classic combination, the combi weapon lieutenant and Lionel Johnson just standing next to each other and looking cool, and the combi weapon lieutenant granting lone operative to Lionel Johnson. But then the other benefit is that Johnson can pick himself up in his own command phase to drop himself back down elsewhere on the table, or hold in reserve and allow you to rapid ingress him to then defend his Deathwing Knights. So as the Deathwing Knights are pushing up the table, maybe you're deep striking them early with Deathwing Assault, your opponent comes in to charge them, Lionel Johnson appears next to them, and then heroically intervenes, fights first, and kills whatever was coming to attack them. So it's pretty interesting stuff from this army. I think the most interesting thing is that it isn't really building for tactical mastery or Weapons of the Dark Age in order to give you +2 strength. Although you can use that on a Desolation squad, it's actually not a terrible place for that to go. However, it is certainly building to just absolutely bully its opponent in the midboard, which the Calidus Assassin helps immensely because it stops you from using things like reactive stratagems or defensive strats in order to mess with its ability to sort of push up the middle. Now, with that, let's return to Rise of the Empire and talk about another undefeated player who didn't quite make the top cut, but did go 4-0-1, tying in the final game in order to qualify for the top cut. This is Nick Toomey, aka Doots, who you're probably familiar with if you are familiar with the channel, or if you're familiar with the Black Crusade Open online event series Doots runs. Now, normally I don't talk about lists that don't make the finals in this way. However, obviously we are looking at a very slim number of events, and getting an undefeated Chaos Space Marine list is obviously very cool. Now, in this case, Doots is playing Fellhammer Siege Host Chaos Space Marines. So for those who don't know, this is kind of similar to Wrath of the Rock. We're actually sort of coming right off of a very similar list archetype to that one. It even includes Cypher, so maybe there's a little bit of a through line here. This gives you a -1 to wound effect from shooting attack if the attack strength is higher than the target's toughness characteristic, so very similar to Wrath of the Rock. It has a ton of anti-shooting defense. This includes things like Steadfast Determination to give you a 5+ Feel No Pain, and the natural damage blank mechanics that Chaos Space Marines will typically be bringing. So in this case, we're running Abaddon the Despoiler, Cypher, Fabius Bile, Vashtor the Archifane, a Chaos Lord and Terminator armor with the Bastion plate, as well as a Lord Discordant, this guy running, which gives him +1 to wound while attacking while on an objective marker. This includes both his melee profile as well as his ranged attack, so he actually gets +1 to wound on his Bale Flamer and Magna Cutter as well, which is kind of sweet. Now, the big benefit here is that we're going to be able to stack a ton of defensive mechanics all together on big heavy infantry bricks. So this includes a Chaos Terminator squad who's going to be able to attach in with the Bastion plate Terminator Lord. These guys are, high toughness value, relatively high toughness value. Baseline, they get that -1 to be wounded effect. They have 3 base wounds and can get a 5+ Feel No Pain. And then, once per turn, the Bastion plate can zero out an incoming damage value from a failed save. On top of that, we have a 10 model Chosen squad that Fabius Bile can hop into. That makes them toughness 5 as well. Fabius Bile also has a damage blank, as well as having the Surgeon Acolyte, who can eat another attack once per game. And Abaddon the Despoiler, if he's nearby, can grant them a 4+ invulnerable save if it's early enough in the game to want to do that. We then have another 5 model Chosen squad for Abaddon to chop into. That's going to be able to give him advance in charge as well. Now, Vashtor doesn't have any explicit synergy, besides just being kind of tanky and enjoying getting the -1 to wound. However, he can come alongside a Forge Fiend. That gives you a good sort of heavy infantry sweeper, a strong range profile once Vashtor's buffing it with his +2 strength aura, but it also gives Vashtor himself lone operative. So you can start Vashtor kind of out in the open and really use him to bully the middle of the table and be annoying to remove. He can move up front and center, force your opponent to come close to him to attack him, and then use the -1 to wound and potentially the 5+ Feel No Pain in order to tank that incoming damage. Once your opponent is that close, you're then able to counterattack with all of your own melee profiles. This includes the Chaos Terminators rapid ingressing onto the board in order to then move, shoot, and charge. They get full hit and wound rerolls when they successfully Dark Pact, so their shooting is actually kind of scary. They're running mass combi weapons, so tons and tons of devastating wound guns from both their Reaper autocannons and their combi attacks. And once they get wound rerolls on those, they're probably forcing, depending on what their target and whether it's an infantry unit, I don't know, somewhere between 5 or 6 mortal wounds onto enemies in most of the time. And that can certainly spike to do even more, which is scary. You have devastating wound attacks from the Forge Fiend as well, and then you get advance in charge baseline from all of the Chosen on top of that. And that is all able to kind of just run up the table at your opponent while being very difficult to kill. -1 to wound, 5+ Feel No Pain, damage blanks on multiple units, just makes it so hard to interact with in a profitable manner. Once they get engaged with you, Chaos Space Marines just tend to do lots of damage. They can get lethal hits or sustained hits with Dark Pacts based on the weapon profile they're trying to go into. They can even stack mortal wounds on enemies from Brutal Attrition, which can deal up to 6 mortal wounds to enemies fighting them in melee, in addition to further getting damage bonuses once in melee from Persistent Assailants, which allows you to get up to full hit and wound rerolls if you have been targeted by an attack but not yet killed during that phase. So this army is just an incredible forward momentum. It's so hard to get rid of once it's out in the open. You have fill no pains and invulnerable saves and damage blanks just coming out of every orifice. And then it's fast enough, especially with the advancing and charging chosen, that it's going to be able to hit you and sort of dominate you in the middle of the table. Very annoying army to take out, and it has a surprisingly high damage output as well. So big congratulations to Dutes for taking an army that is otherwise not very well represented to an undefeated record. And with that, that's going to be all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Big thanks to you for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to US Warmaster for sponsoring this video, as well as everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing. I love you so much. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.